Davis Fournier, Deputy Director of the ALA Public Programs Office. Welcome to the Sweet Spot of Public Innovation, the sixth and final webinar in this six-part distance learning series. This series has been part of ALA's Libraries Transforming Communities initiative, which addresses a critical need within the library field by developing and distributing tools and resources to support the work of engaging communities in new ways. Through this initiative, ALA seeks to strengthen the role of library professionals as core community leaders and change agents. ALA has partnered with the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation for this wide-ranging project, based on their approach of turning outward to effect community change. Libraries Transforming Communities is made possible through a grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Today's session departs slightly from previous webinars in this series in a couple of ways. You are encouraged to self-pace your learning during this session by pausing at points for readings, audio, and video content. This entire series refers to the Public Innovators Lab workbook as a core reference material. And throughout the PowerPoint presentation, you'll see page number references occasionally at the bottom of slides. These refer to page numbers in the Public Innovators Lab workbook. This workbook is available for download at ala.org/LTC. For this webinar, you will want to have the following tools at hand: the space you occupy, the KNPR story, moving from aspirations to action, and you may want to consult the third image, the third page listed here, which is a listing of all the links presented in this webinar. These are all available on the Libraries Transforming Communities website, ala.org/LTC. And I am now so happy to welcome back the familiar voice and style of our facilitator, Carlton Sears. Carlton is a certified Harwood coach and one of the key architects of the Libraries Transforming Communities initiative. Thank you for taking us through this learning
There's an idea I want to tell you about. It's called the sweet spot of public life, and it relates to public capital. Think of it this way. Think about the public challenge that you're working on in your community, the specific public challenge that you're working on. Now think about public capital, the 2 or 3 public capital factors that if you work on in relationship to that public challenge, you can leverage change. Not just on that specific public challenge that you're working on, but that you can create the conditions for change over the long term. The place where we get the most leverage, the place where we get the most alignment, the place where we can create the most progress in our community is when we work on public challenges and build community at the same time. And that means focusing on the right public capital factors so that you can create the kind of change that you're looking for. In every community that I've looked at that has created effective change, I've always found a collection of catalytic organizations. These are groups that have been able to span dividing lines and bring people together, incubate new ideas and spin them off, hold a mirror up so that we can see our shared reality. There are a lot of organizations and communities doing good work in small niches, and we need them to do that work. But we also need catalytic organizations to work across these dividing lines and bring us together and form the foundation for change. Every community needs them.
So in that particular video, Rich referred to boundary spanning organizations as catalytic organizations. And don't get too hung up on whether we call it catalytic organizations or boundary spanning organizations. The thing to think about is this is a key public capital factor in any community. Boundary spanning organizations help engage people in public life, spur discussion on community challenges, and marshal the community's resources to move ahead. They help lay the foundation for community action, but don't necessarily act as the driving force for that action. To give you a little bit more definition around boundary spanning organizations, as Rich said, they're a candid friend that holds a mirror up to the community to see shared aspirations. They bring people together, take action on shared aspirations in a way that builds community conditions and culture at the same time. They're an organization that models and champions turning outward to the community as a norm for the way they work, and they're committed to sustaining that work over time. They're an organization that continuously learns and innovates and shares the knowledge that they gain widely so that other groups can engage in the shared work together. As Rich said, they're an essential component of community change. The key question for boundary spanning organizations is really the one that's on the screen right now. What space do you want to occupy in relationship to the community? And how you answer that depends on whether or not you are turned outward to the community or whether you're turned inward. To give you a better sense of what this is about, we've gone back and taken a look at some of the work that we've done with public broadcasting stations. And we have a couple pictures that these organizations created at different points in their journey. So this particular question here the particular drawing here was drawn from the early part of the public broadcasting station training. And the question that was asked of the stations at that time was, how do people in the community perceive the station? And I'd like you to take just a minute now to look at these questions and think of this. This is how they responded to how do people in the community perceive the public broadcasting station. So you may want to take a little more time, and you can just pause the webinar at this point to study this picture if you want. But once you've done that, go on and look to the second set of drawings that they created. The second set of drawings was created later in the training, and the question that was asked of the stations was, how do you want people to perceive the station? And again, pause and just take a look at these pictures, and you might want to pause the webinar at this point and look at how they responded to this question. How do you want people to perceive the station? So as you can see in the previous drawings, the stations shifted their orientation from being turned inward, with the station at the center of things, or with the community not even being present, to being turned outward, with the station being a part of the community and seen in relationship to other organizations and networks of people. These drawing exercises were part of boundary spanning training on what space do you want to occupy in the community. And the orientation really drives how you answer that question. It profoundly impacts how you think about your work, how it's funded, and the partners you want to work with. All of the questions that we were asking in the Moving from Aspirations to Action, Taking Effective Civic Action document. Using a turned outward lens, when you ask fundamentally different questions that will ensure your work is better aligned with the community, you end up coming up with answers that are in a more turned outward fashion. We use the question, what space do you want to occupy, as shorthand for all of the questions that you see on the right hand of this screen here. Questions like, if you're turned inward, what do we want to do? As opposed to turn outward, what needs to be done to create change? Or for example, how do we educate the community to see why our program is needed, to how does our work fit with what's going on in the community? So to give you an idea of what this actually looks like for a real organization, we want you to take a few minutes to read a brief story from KNPR, the flagship affiliate of National Public Radio in Las Vegas. And then ask yourself, after you read the KNPR story, part 1, what needs to be done to create change in this community? What is the most pressing public capital factor to work on? So I'd like you to take a pause in the webinar right now and read this, The Space You Occupy, the KNPR story. So now let's see what Flo Rogers, KNPR station manager, had to say about how she saw the space that KNPR occupies in the community. So I'd like you to take a little bit of time to read part 2 of the KNPR story, The Space You Occupy, and ask yourself these questions. What space has KNPR decided to occupy in the community? What additional public capital factors are they working on? So pause now and read the second part of the KNPR story. And in a minute, we'll go on and hear from Flo Rogers herself. So now let's see what Flo Rogers, KNPR's station manager, had to say about how she saw the space that KNPR occupies in the community.
When you ask people where they're from in Las Vegas, they say the place they last came from, to a T. They never say they're from Las Vegas. 97% of the population of Southern Nevada are from somewhere else. There's only 3% of the population that are native born. So if you want to look at it in terms of what would be a colloquial way of saying what is the public challenge that we're addressing ourselves to, I want people to say they're from Las Vegas. Combination of the public affairs programming that we do, the Community Connections Project, reorienting our website around the sort of participatory nature of some of the things that we do, trying to invite people in rather than being just a companion website to the programming, and also orienting our entire organization from the top down to an idea that our role in the community is to sort of own that space, that sense of place and that sense of community.
So let's take a look at the KNPR experience. Through gathering public knowledge, KNPR realized that having conscious community discussions about what does it mean to be a Las Vegan was the most important public capital factor to work on. In addition, having organized spaces for interaction would be key to moving from answering this question to taking action on what it means to be a Las Vegan. The station decided the space they wanted to occupy in relation to the community conditions was being a convener and a connector of people who currently did not meet each other or traditionally work together. This decision was driven by an assessment of the assets KNPR had in relation to what Las Vegas needed to become a better community. Notice that the action KNPR took was a combination of adapting work they currently did and adding some new work. And these are some ideas of boundary spanning functions for KNPR, it's connector and convener. These are some boundary spanning functions that have surfaced for other organizations. In the library's case, use your stages of community life, do's and don'ts chart from Community Rhythms to help identify good functions to match your stage. For example, storytelling starts in impasse, but becomes really critical in the catalytic phase when old and emerging community narratives begin to clash. So ask yourself, what function is needed to create change in your community? And then, what is the space that you occupy? With that in mind, you're prepared to complete the last question of step 1 of the Moving from Aspirations to Action chart, called Boundary Spanning Functions, and begin to ask yourself the question, what are the implications for your organization? So at this point, just to recap what you have so far, you've completed step 1 of the Moving from Aspirations to Action summary. You've determined that you have enough public capital to stand on the table. You have identified how your current work addresses people's shared aspirations, concerns, and issues. You've identified how your current work aligns with the recommended actions for the stage of community life that you're at. And you've identified how your current work supports the development of the public capital factors that you've determined to work on. And you've determined what space you want to occupy as a library, and that leads you to who you want and who you need as partners. So now you're ready to move on to step 2, which is selecting pockets of change. Listening to gain public knowledge and then sharing it broadly is an essential first step to community change. While listening and sharing are actions in and of themselves, they need to be coupled with other actions that give people a sense of momentum and possibility. In the Harwood practice, we call these pockets of change. You don't always have to think about selecting pockets of change as starting something new. You can think about adapting or adjusting something that you're already doing to better fit the stage of community life that you're at and the shared community aspirations that you've identified. You can also think about really making intentional choices and judgments about your current work to either continue, discontinue, or considering what you need to change to have it better fit with what you want to get done. As you think about taking on new work, ask yourself, given public knowledge, what is already underway in the community that you can enhance or build upon? Where is there energy and the will to work together towards those shared aspirations and those concerns? Where can you win collectively and create proof points so people regain a sense of confidence and belief and momentum is built? And also, let's not forget the expert knowledge. What does expert knowledge suggest to us that we should consider if a concern or an issue has surfaced to work on? So next we have a public library story for you. This is another place to take a pause and listen to the story. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about what you're going to hear. This is an 8-minute interview with Heidi Daniel, the director of the Public Library of Youngstown and Mahoning County. Heidi became director of the library in July 2012. When she came to the library, a wide variety of people in the community had already participated in full 90-minute Harwood community conversations that focused on gaining the public knowledge that we've been talking about throughout this webinar series. The notes and themes from these conversations were shared with Heidi, and she decided that she wanted to do more of the conversations and sit in them herself to hear directly what people had to say and to gain a deeper understanding of the community that she had just moved to. In this story, she's sharing the impact the knowledge she gained had on decisions she was making about the future of one of the branch libraries she operated, the West Branch Library. This particular library is in an old building in a neighborhood of the city that has experienced many years of disinvestment. It's one of 16 branches that she's responsible for. So, and after listening to the story, we'll come back and I'll give you a little bit of a sequel as to what's happened since.
On the west side, a branch that is older and deteriorating, and we needed to do something about it. And it's been a struggle, but we had a lot of conversations on that side of the town when you were director, before I got here, those conversations started. They continued, and then from all of those conversations, I was able to, at some point in time, sit down and say, this is what I hear is really important to your community. Mm-hmm. These are the struggles that I hear your neighborhood has. This is the narrative I'm hearing. Mm-hmm. And when I reflect on that, I start to look at how are there other opportunities, and also what are the barriers to taking those opportunities. So we have an opportunity. One of the things we heard a lot was develop the park in that neighborhood and community was a huge asset, and so was the library, and that was really important to them. And they also said, we would like to see more public partnerships. But we also know that there's this idea of disinvestment in that community, and that there's fears of blight and a lot of challenges, and they want to maintain their sense of neighborhood and their sense of community that they've always had, but they're a neighborhood in transition and have been transitioning, maybe not positively, for a long time, and they'd like to change the tide of that transition. So we have this building. What do we do with it? We know now we can't leave the community because of this narrative of disinvestment. And what the library means to them is more than just a place to check out books. It's an anchor institution. So how do we just leave them? Well, we've also heard they want more public partnerships. So then we turn to the park and say, hey, you have this old warming house. It's also an important history piece for your community because it was always used for ice skating, and now it's just sort of not being utilized.
How did that come to your attention?
So after I had all these conversations, I said, well, we have to do something. And I was able to reflect back to at least some community members. This is what I'm hearing from you. You know, I did a neighborhood association meeting with a neighborhood group where the library is actually located. and reflected back to them and said, this is what I'm hearing from you, that you would like these amenities in a library. Did I get it right? And, basically they were like, yeah, that's what we wanted. That's what we want to see in a library. So I started to question, well, some of this I can't do in the existing structure. So I had an architect engaged an architect in a feasibility study, and that architect knew of my desires to provide these types of programs. They also knew that I was really interested in shared spaces and public partnerships, and I gave them the information that I had about these are what they value as assets in their community. So then
why were you really interested in those?
Well, first of all, we heard that over and over again, that people would like to see more public partnerships. And also because, interestingly, and this isn't just this community, but countywide, I think we heard a narrative of, and not just from our conversations, but from conversations other groups have done, through the work they did with the school, that Harwood did with the schools, this narrative of just sort of like distrust in leadership, and that they don't see a lot of cooperation, and sort of this idea of no one's working together, or why aren't more public entities working together. I mean, I think that that's something that pops up in a lot of conversations.
You think?
Yeah, I do. So you start to think, well, how do you build public trust? And then when you think about Harwood and the work, it talks about where do you see those pockets of change happening, and how do you see groups working together for those pockets of change, and where do you see that positive? And so we start to think, well, who are the groups that we can work with that can impact that change too? And so I hear that there's two assets in that community, the library and the park. Well, how can we work together to create a pocket of change in that neighborhood? That would also, for me, the one thing that you can't forget about here is that I have to be a steward of fiscal dollars for the entire county. The whole county pays taxes for the library, and those tax dollars have to be used in a fiscally responsible way with good fiscal stewardship. But the other thing we heard was that people, when they say fiscal stewardship, they don't always mean don't spend the money. They mean spend it in a way that's meaningful. That's all they want. They don't want me to fritter it away on,
Ice cream.
Yeah, there you go. But in ways that are meaningful. So maybe the ice cream has to be connected to a deeper learning program. But so the architect knew I was interested in all of that, and I shared that information with them. And they suggested, well, why don't we look at this other public, why don't we look at their master plan? There's this asset here, this other public asset here, a mile away from where we are, from where our building is, a little over a mile away. And it has a long and storied history in our community. People will tell you, I skated there as a child, and the sense of wanting to pass it on, but then there's also this reality of it hasn't been open for 20 years, and there's really no plans to open it. In the future, it's really not a feasible option. So the Parks Master Plan called for something to happen, like a healthy living lodge. And so we looked at that and we said, well, I wonder if we could do something there. Like maybe we, instead of a healthy living lodge, maybe it could be a library. We could have a library in the park. It could be this whole new service model for us. And I can incorporate all of these things that I've heard the community wants into this, and bring back this sort of storied history, and have a public partnership between two taxpayer-funded entities to create something really cool in a community. And so we presented that, and it's in a community where we expected it to sort of, because it's scary. First of all, people don't like anything new. We knew that what they were going to say is, no, I just want you to fix what you have there, because I know what you have on Mahoning Avenue. I know what that is like, and just fix it, because that's what we know. So it's a hard sell, and we're continuing the facilitation with, a facilitator who I believe will be using some Harwood techniques and facilitating these conversations.
Yeah, we're meeting Sunday evening.
Are you? Good, yeah. So I think we're going to be having these sort of, we picked a committee of people from every neighborhood group in the west side. We're keeping it to residents on that side, as well as a board member from the library. And we're going to have some more conversations about it. But the good thing is, because I listened or tried to listen, to the community, we had so many conversations. Not me, the library, because the library listened and tried to have all these community conversations. We know that the main issues were transportation. There was no public bus route currently to the park. And we know that we're really moving it from a lower populated area to a higher populated area. And what is the implication of that for people who live in this higher need area to be able to still get to that location easily? So again, when you talk about public partnerships, we approached our public transit, WRTA, and they are going to provide a bus route there. So this is actually, then you start to get bigger, because then you're like, whoa, we're providing an opportunity for people to access this park and this outdoor recreation area with a kids playground and with a golf course and with lots of walking paths. And I think there's tennis courts or volleyball. There's all kinds of stuff over there. So now you're talking about something else too, because now if WRTA comes on board and they start to provide a bus route, well, can we make it so that these other people who probably couldn't access the park before, well, now they can also access not just the library, but all of this outdoor recreation. So is that another way that you combine public entities to kind of build something bigger for you? We've got 3 public entities sitting down together to talk about delivering a service model for a community.
After listening to Heidi's story, here's 3 questions that you could ask yourself. How is public knowledge being used in this situation? Where do you see movement toward communities' shared aspirations? And what kind of actions are encouraging others to become engaged? I would encourage you, after listening to that story, maybe go back and listen to it again, and think about these 3 questions as illustrative of how public knowledge is being used and how that relates to encouraging others to be engaged and moving towards shared aspirations. We have an optional reading as well from Why We're Here, which is a story about the 10 public broadcasting stations, which went through a very similar initiative as the libraries are going through with Libraries Transforming Communities. Chapter 6 of that book, Occupying New Space, and Chapter 7, New Programming, New Partners, and New Online Spaces, gives more detail about how public broadcasting stations went about creating pockets of change. But before moving on to that, I want to give you a little bit of a sequel to Heidi's story, because her story is not yet complete. Since the interview that you just listened to, the director of the park system moved on to another job, and several board members of the park were replaced with other board members, and they hired a new director that came in from outside of the community. That raises a situation of uncertainty around a commitment of the park to move forward with the idea. In addition to that, Heidi faced politicians that appear to want to move in a different direction than what the people in the community actually said they wanted. This story at this point doesn't really even have an ending. It's still evolving, but it does provide excellent insight into how public knowledge can be used in a very targeted way to inspire others to act and get involved with a concern of the community. So moving on to selecting pockets of change. In the Moving from Aspirations to Action chart, you've completed step 1. Now it's really into completing step 2. Take time to list pockets that you can work on in your Moving from Aspirations to Action document. What are the pockets of change that are a good place for you to start? Is it something where you're tweaking or modifying something that you're already doing? Or is it something that you're starting from fresh and new? Summarize the decisions that you're making in step 3 of the Moving from Aspirations to Action chart. But be sure to ask yourself this intentionality test on authenticity. Will you be able to live up to your pledges and promises? It becomes really important at this point to be really clear and honest with yourself about whether or not you can live up to what you say that you intend to do. Once you do that, what we'd like you to do is to fill out step 3. This is really a decision summary for your organization. And in all these pieces, let me underline, this is best done as a team, because what you're doing by filling out the taking effective civic action step 1, filling out step 2, and then moving on to step 3, you're making judgments and decisions as a team. Step 3 here is about making those choices and deliberations really concrete and putting them on one page as a shared record that you can use as a quick reference. Now I want to focus a little bit on some traps to avoid. And we've touched on these in some of the previous webinars. When it comes to looking at changing conditions in a community, these are called public capital factors. And quite often, organizations will pick out too many to work on. If you pick out too many to work on, you can get easily overwhelmed and you can lose momentum. So we really encourage you to think about only picking 2 or 3. And to be honest, I get a little nervous when people say they can pick 3. Really ask yourself, if you do pick 3, do you have the capacity to make good on that? Another trap is that you don't continually align your efforts to stay in that sweet spot where you're working on a condition and you're changing the conditions at the same time. This is the type of thing that you need to go back and revisit and make sure you're continually aligned. And finally, that we treat building conditions for change as a standalone project rather than leveraging your existing efforts. Quite often we find that people are successful in modifying or tweaking things that they're already doing to become more aligned with working in the sweet spot. And we want to close in this section on some keys for building and sustaining momentum. One of the most missed opportunities that is most effective is this notion around hidden narratives. All communities have stories that they tell themselves about who they are and what's happening and what can happen. These are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. When you're at a stage of impasse, there needs to be new narrative emerging, but when you start moving into catalytic, there's actually a competition between old narratives and new narratives. The thing that's important is to lift up your stories of change from working in the sweet spot and share those stories so other people gain a sense of belief and new possibility that the kind of community that they want to create can actually be created. Telling these stories becomes a really critical part of the ability to move forward and create change. The pebble theory of change is another key factor. Progress emerges by having pockets of change that people see, there's an action that's taken place here, they're building new conditions, I'm regaining a sense of belief, and then another pocket emerges where they see the same thing happen, and then another pocket emerges. The idea around picking an action that you can stay focused on that is going to work on shared aspirations and concerns and build public capital at the same time that people can actually believe in, and then seeing others emerge builds a sense of momentum in a community that the community is changing. Be careful not to try to coordinate those until you're well into the mid part or late catalytic stage, because what you want at earlier stages is you just want those actions so people regain a sense of belief that change can take place. Change happens over time. That's another thing to keep in mind. You're calibrating your actions and the working and selecting a pocket of change. You're going to start in one place. You're going to build on that intentionally, and this change emerges over time. And that's okay. You want to approach your work as with an understanding that whatever you're doing right now is laying a foundation for what's going to come next. That's going to lay a foundation for what next, and that change occurs over time. And as I said earlier, be realistic about the expectations that you can expect. The more advanced your stage, the more ambitious your scope, scale, and speed can be. Failing to consider fully how much you can take on can really damage your authority and authenticity. Another idea for building and sustaining momentum is to really embed turning outward across your organization. Remember that you need board champions as well as senior staff as champions. Turning outward, as we've said so many times, it's a mindset, it's a practice, it's a commitment to an ongoing gathering and sharing of public knowledge, using that knowledge to reflect on in innovation space on a regular basis, and seeking other partners that you can work with to achieve where you're wanting to go. So in closing our webinar series, there's really 3 questions I'd like you to consider. The first is, are you turned outward? Do you have the community as your primary reference point for change? Do you understand your community and their shared aspirations? Do you have the public knowledge that you can actually stand on the table? Tell them about their shared aspirations and their concerns, and would they believe you? And do you know where your community is at in terms of its stage of development and the actions that will fit given the stage? And why are these 3 questions important? They're important because basically without knowing having answers to these 3 questions, we can't realize our shared aspirations. So at this point, I want to thank you for the opportunity to participate in this and turn it back to Mary Davis Fournier.
Thank you so much, Carlton. Thank you for this session and for this entire series. And to those who are participating, thank you for taking part in this distance learning series. We invite you to share your feedback and your experiences with the Turning Outward tools and library-led community engagement with us and with your peers. We encourage you to join the community of practice found on the ALA Connect site, connect.ala.org. You'll see the link on your screen. This group offers a place for library professionals to share experiences and join in virtual conversations about all aspects of community engagement work. I'd also like to remind you that for additional Libraries Transforming Communities resources, please go to our initiative website at ala.org/LTC. You'll find there information on our Public Innovators cohort,